All right, what's up, everybody? We're actually a little bit early today, so welcome back, Stan. We are here to talk about I don't even know. we didn't plan it out, so we're going to have a really open-ended discussion, see where it goes. If you watch the last video, you'll see that we talked a bit about Stan's background and experience and how you got to where you got. And one of the things that led us both to talking and interacting was a similar sort of meta-philosophical approach to philosophy, where we've both sort of converged on noticing that many problems in philosophy arise from people not being sensitive to polysemy. So the fact that words are used in they don't have rigid, fixed textbook dictionary definitions. They're not chiseled into the fabric of the universal language. Is flexible and amorphous and constantly moving. And you might think that's a problem with language, but that's actually one of the things that's beautiful and useful and awesome about language. But it trips up philosophers, and by extension, the people that read philosophers. And so I've noticed this. You've noticed this. We, there's that really tropey phrase, "We stand on the shoulders of giants." It's not like I had a grand insight while I was in the shower and was like, it's all about language. This is built on the whole history of 20th century philosophy, where you have people like Wittgenstein noticing and observing this and pointing it out. And then some philosophers, I guess maybe some people took him seriously, because he would be like, "Don't do philosophy. It's a bunch of language nonsense. Quit and go do something useful." Maybe all those people just quit and did something useful. And so what's left are all the people that are like, screw you, Wittgenstein, I'm going to keep doing philosophy. But I've stuck around, you're around. So there's still some of us around saying, hey, pay attention to language. So I guess that should situate us. So yeah, with that being said, how are you doing? What's going on? What's up?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you talk about, is there a selection bias happening? Because one of the whole things about quietism is that it's as opposed to loudism, I guess, right? The party, the institution, the legacy, the drama, the debate that's been raging for centuries. Clearly, I'm not going to come to it and solve it, because its identity is a thing that doesn't land, right? Its identity is this legacy, this party. And if you leave, if you say, actually, there's a boring answer, which is, it depends how you want to define these two terms. And that's it. Well, that's not fun. And in fact, there's no more conversation. So then you have quiet, and nobody hears from quiet, right? You don't hear it. It's quiet. There's nobody talking anymore. And as a result, you have these writers that are saying some really refreshing things. Like, here's a cool glass of water. Okay. But then the result is that I'm healed of this pernicious dream. I've woken up, and it's not I'm not part of the party anymore. It's like you're at a party, right? And music is playing, and you can't stand this kind of music. And at first you tolerate it, but then after a while you're like, you know what? It's Friday night. I'm going to go to a different party. I got my friend, he's over here. I'm just going to leave because this music, it sucks. And you leave. And then slowly, as the hours go on, more and more people who share your opinion of the kind of music also leave the party. Now, suddenly you have a situation where all the people in the party are looking around. And if they were to ask about this music, they would get unanimous or near unanimous approval of this kind of music, right? Because those are the people that stuck around. And so they think they're all into it. It's good stuff. But that's because the people who saw a problem with it just tend not to be there anymore, or they never engaged with it in the first place. And this is sometimes pointing this out can feel almost like conspiratorial or very offensive, right? Especially for people who have lots of sunk costs in the institution. I don't know if there's a solution necessarily for that, except to find ways of getting excited, even though you're not taking part in the traditional conversation anymore. Like, can we get vocal and loud and have some fun and keep talking, even though at the end of the day, the answers that we seek are things that are like, it depends on how you want to define those terms. That's really it. That's all it ever was.
Yeah, I certainly have lots to say, and I do think there's so much philosophical work that could be done when you dispense with the traditional problems. Among other things, one of the things coming to appreciate the trickiness of language has caused me to appreciate is the trickiness of language. That strikes me as super interesting. When you discover, and I know you've blogged about this, and you sometimes have tweets where you go over some of these sorts of tricky features of language. I find that really interesting. Maybe that's not what initially motivated philosophers. I do think that seems like a step down from the grand and epic sweeping problems that philosophers deal with. What is nature composed of? Like, what do we have free will? Does God exist? Many of these questions, and maybe some of these questions are tractable, but some of them, like for instance, I don't think that the free will question is tractable. I'm a quietist about free will. I'm not a quietist about like other sorts of questions. I'm not a quietist across the board. So one of the things is, if you get rid of the kind of pointless wheel spinning questions, you can redirect your attention towards the ones you think are valuable. For me, that's typically going to be practical questions. So there's that.
Right.
It's also just that, okay, so maybe that epic grand stuff that people were aspiring to, that might feel nice, but one would have thought philosophers want to pursue what's true. And so if it turns out that those issues are pseudo issues, they're not real philosophical problems, accept that and move towards addressing other. There's so many issues to address. I do worry though that, I've suggested, for me, I've become more interested in language, and I've also been interested this whole time in psychology. So I've had a foot in another door. For many philosophers, it looks like, as analytic philosophy is emerging, you have this success of all the sciences. Chemistry was coming into its own, geology and physics, and mathematics made huge strides. And so all these fields had massive practical success. They became rock stars of the domains that they oversaw. And philosophy, I'm not sure that it looks like it tried to grab some of that and take it for its own. And maybe that didn't work out too well. But to the extent that philosophers are aspiring to carve out an autonomous discipline, a discipline that's like, okay, fine, you go have your trophies playing your games, your chemistry game and your all your science games. We're going to have our own. Maybe there was something misguided about that, because my own view of philosophy is a lot more in line with people that call it like synthetic philosophy. I see philosophy as playing the role, among other roles, of stitching all these fields together, and it has such an important auxiliary role to play in binding the rest of the fields and creating conceptual bridges between them so that we could better understand how everything fits together. That strikes me as a noble, valuable, and worthwhile pursuit. I don't see that. And that can also allow one to appreciate and subsume oneself in, if one really loves the epic stuff, all that one finds in the sciences. Biology is incredible. Cosmology is mind-blowing. Like, why can't people reap the rewards of those fields while doing philosophy? It's another thing to point out about philosophy prior to the 20th century is that philosophers themselves were often these sort of like these polymaths that would dip their hands into mathematics and sciences. And this has long been a tradition in philosophy, in both early modern philosophy and ancient philosophy. They did other stuff, and philosophy had always played this role of looking at things from that bird's eye view, but also the people that looked at it from that view, they got some insights from landing on the ground once in a while and putting their feet over here, putting over there. And it looks like philosophers don't want to do that. They're like, I just want to stay up in the sky and never come down. And maybe there's just something wrong with the whole big picture of what philosophers are doing.
Yeah, if we go back to our party analogy, like, you leave to do stuff that seems to have more of a material impact, right? More clearer results. and good attention, like attention for learning something really interesting and cool, that then we can all say, look at what we discovered. Now we know this, right? And we didn't know it before. And that is like, I mean, we all see the appeal in that. And so as the sciences have gotten more and more, more deep, requiring more and more expertise and education to get to the point where you even know what you're talking about in a certain kind of field, you have to leave a little bit, unless you're just happy with like a cursory understanding, or you're depending on others to interpret things for you, which of course that's what I largely do because I'm not actually a scientist or researcher or anything. And uh but then you can get into this thing where it's like, well, if they're leaving, you go from this polymath party, and then you have a bunch of people leaving to scientists and empirical research and things like that. Who's left? And uh and you can get into this thing where it's like, oh well, philosophers are left holding a certain kind of field, a field of puzzles that present as if the conclusions are imminent and as if we're making progress, but they'll never land. And there are things like that, like where there are problems that are language issues. They just come from how you're defining things, but they don't present as language issues for various reasons. Those kinds of discussions go in a circle. They spin forever. They're little perpetual motion machines. And then you get into a situation where it's like, oh, that's largely what philosophy is nowadays. I would never say it's the whole thing. I sometimes say it's a big bath with a lot of bath water, but there is a baby in it, right? But if you just randomly pick something in philosophy, you're going to just point at another one of these weird widgets. Free will is one of the biggest ones. Like there are at least 4 definitions that people commonly use the term free will for, or combinations of those definitions, or they'll start with one and then they'll hop to a different one and they won't even realize that they're talking about something different now. And there's a spin cycle that starts to occur when you try to like nail down, wait, what are we talking? Are we talking about moral responsibility in terms of obligation? Are we talking about a lethic possibility of 2 contradictory choices? Are we talking about me being the ultimate cause of things? I don't think I'm the ultimate cause of things. Wasn't I a blastocyst once? And like you go through all of these different things, and there you start to see the grooves in the carpet where people get trapped in different kinds of polysemies and different kinds of bad inferences. And eventually you say, I think there's something wrong. I think there's something wrong with the debate. Look, I'm looking at this paper. It doesn't even bother defining what free will is. It just starts talking about it as if everyone kind of knows. And you're like, well, that's bad. And we kind of need to be loud about how bad that is. But then, you talk about this, you complain about it, you're ringing the alarm. You get a lot of people who are like, yeah, I think you're right. That is pretty bad. But then nothing changes. Like the debate almost has this self-perpetuating thing where the guys getting attention are the ones with something wrong. And I used to be in Facebook games over a decade ago. And so, I mean, I was doing product management and analysis with like the feed algorithms and like the virals that people were sending back and forth and all this kind of stuff. And what we learned very early on is the stuff that goes organically viral is the stuff that has something wrong with it. A math puzzle where not everyone knows the orders of operations, or a math puzzle where you give the wrong answer to it, and then you have a bunch of people commenting saying, what? No, that's not the answer. Don't you know? And I learned quickly that you can trigger people into loudness by using ambiguity, by using error. And it's almost as if people are water that you can channel through pipes if they're architected right, or architected maliciously. And sometimes I think that, oh, here's this natural thing. Nobody architected it. But if it so happens that a certain kind of discourse has these features, this is what we expect to happen. It will be self-selecting, it'll be self-perpetuating, and it will send strong social signals that something is important here, but nothing is important there. Or the important thing is actually this thing over here that someone has to yank you over to see. And then they'll look like they're out of their mind, right? Because they're disagreeing with the institution, the legacy, the luminaries, right? And so that's also why, like you said, you stand on the shoulder of giants. You remind people that, look, I'm not the only one saying this. It's just you haven't heard from us because we're in a different conversation.
That example you have reminds me of something I just came across on Facebook maybe a couple days ago, where I almost commented and it was like, no, it was just a very quick little like infograph thing that was like it said something about the Romans, and then it said the Emperor Julius Caesar, and then it went on, and I was about to write a comment like, technically, Julius Caesar was not an emperor, and I'm sure that if I went and checked the comments, that there would be dozens of people saying that just because they're like, but
Yeah.
I have to wonder if they intentionally included that little bit of mistaken like pseudo trivia in there, like explicitly, just to get that engagement from people in the comments all going, Julius Caesar wasn't an emperor, like dozens of them. Because
Yes.
then, oh, wow, suddenly it's 500 comments.
Right. And now you see the evolutionary parallel because, like, yeah, you can deliberately do this. I mean, like, in the background, there are sometimes discussions about people doing, in the industry, we call it dark-sided stuff, which we are trying to avoid. Like, I know it's easy to be cynical about the entertainment industry, but in the background, like, we know that this stuff is happening, and we don't want this happening to us or our friends and family, quite frankly. And so we were trying to find effective ways to get the job done without doing that kind of stuff. You can do it on purpose, but you can do it not on purpose. If that's an innocent mistake, but you do it, you get the same payoff, right? I don't think these folks writing papers about free will and failing to define it are doing so because they're like, oh, I know what to do. I'm going to use this term ambiguously, and then I'm going to get all sorts of attention for my nonsense that enable. They're probably just doing what they see everybody else doing, thinking they're onto something, stumbling upon a very attention-getting conclusion. They look at their syllogism, they're like, seems pretty tight to me. I don't see myself hopping any gaps. Release the paper, tons of chatter, a bunch of people being like, this doesn't make any sense. That's really overconfident. Here's the problems with that. And the person didn't try, but now that's the one everyone's talking about. And I don't want to get too deep into this, but I predicted that this would happen with the psychophysical harmony paper when that first came out a couple years ago, and I started to see chatter on it. I started to see it go viral. I'm like, oh, I got to read this. I read it, and there were instances of polysemy. There were instances of things that I suspected were equivocal, but were being given lexically different labels. And that was being used to create a conceivability gap to run their kind of like hypothetical simulations. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is pulling every trick in the book. I bet that this is going to go somewhere. Like, it's very thorough. They clearly are sincere. Like, they're not trying to hoodwink anyone. And the paper is structured so it just follows trees of available interpretations, like so dense with all of that kind of stuff. But you almost have to set that aside and say, but wait, what are you doing right here? And then when you unpack that, you realize, okay, this whole thing has it's fluff. It depends on how you define those two things. And when I saw that, I was just like, oh yeah, I'm pretty sure this is going to be hot, because this is the kind of thing that goes hot in philosophy.
It is appearing to go hot. I mean, one thing to say about that is that when I saw one of the discussions, I think it was on Capturing Christianity with, I don't remember if it was, so if people don't know, it was a forthcoming paper at the time. Maybe it's out now by Cutter and Crummett on psychophysical harmony. And it's an interesting paper. When it came out, one of them was on Capturing Christianity discussing it. And I got really fired up about responding to that paper. I ended up writing 4 blog posts about the paper. Now think about that. I wrote 4 blog posts about a paper that wasn't even published yet.
Yeah.
And so that paper, like, I don't have a big blog, but it did something to me that made me go, I have to address this.
Yeah.
I've now seen people just casually dropping psychophysical harmony, psychophysical harmony.
Yeah.
I've seen Philip Goff mention psychophysical harmony or discuss it. I'm pretty sure. And Goff is fairly prominent in the philosophy of mind circles. And so the one thing to say is that the paper itself has that kind of, it prompts a response from people. I think you're right about that. And then, I'm not intending to get into an analysis of the paper, so no worries. But something about that term too. There's something about the term where it like sticks with you. Psychophysical harmony. It sounds like, ooh, what is that? I want to know what that is.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you put psycho on the front of everything. It's like, oh, whoa. And then harmony. Oh, sweet. The man, sometimes my brain makes some odd connections, but here's what came to mind as you were talking about that. There's I spend a lot of time trying to convince people that evolution is true. That's one of my topics, and one of my interest areas is like, hey, let's get educated about what evolution does and doesn't mean, the trade-offs, all this kind of stuff, because it's important, and it informs us about the evolution of language or the evolution of ideas or all this other kind of stuff. But sometimes when you're talking with people, they say, okay, this is a nice theory, but you don't see it happening right in front of you, right? And of course, that's not true. But sometimes it's hard to come up with an example, and then suddenly you see one happening, which is the and this doesn't go as far as some people expect, but it's tuskless elephants, the fitness and emergence of tuskless elephants in Africa, because the ones with tusks are more likely to be hunted. And you have this, adaptation basically based on humans being garbage, and it's happening right in front of you. And the feeling that I get when I think about that example is the feeling that I get about this kind of paper, where it was just like, these are usually the things that I'm nitpicking about or like going against are really old arguments, like the ontological argument, the various cosmological arguments, lots of philosophy of religion stuff, but then also like problems with the free will discussion and compatibilism, libertarianism, and so to see something come out live and to just have that sinking feeling that it's like, this has the telltale stuff, and then just watching it happen like right in front of you. And over the last couple of years, just watching more and more people just casually drop it as a thing to refer to. A fellow the other day I saw say, oh yeah, this is one of the most powerful arguments for the supernatural. And it makes a quietist want to scream, quite frankly.
Yeah, not like, and quietism is deeply relevant to how that paper is framed and structured, because what the paper, I see it doing is it's basically saying, hey, look, so most naturalists are going to be non-reductive about the certain sorts of properties, and so they're really going to struggle to account for these psychophysical laws. And in a footnote, they mention, there's like these like other physicalists, like more reductive physicalists, they just totally circumvent this problem because they just are going to reject that there are the psychophysical laws. They don't believe in phenomenal states or qualia in the first place. And so there isn't one thing to harmonize with another thing. There's just the one thing. And so there's no harmony on those views. But they kind of just are like, they just mention that in a footnote, and then they don't address that in the paper. And that's fine. I understand that not every paper can address every possible, like, it's not like, imagine if every single philosophy paper you wrote, a skeptic comes along, like a global skeptic, and it's like, but technically you didn't address global skepticism. How do you know anything you're saying in the paper?
Right.
I mean, that'd be a bit silly to have to address. And so it's fine to say, look, there's a dominant view relevant in this discussion, but we're going to set that aside. one, because it's not as common, and two, because we find it personally like super implausible, which I think is basically what they say and what their stance is. And that's fine from a structural perspective. On the other hand, I am one of those people that is relegated to the footnote because I'm a
Right.
qualia quiet.
Yeah.
So I'm just told, like, it's not even like I'm not even an illusionist. I'm a qualia quietist. Like, I saw Pete Mandick's paper at the time. There was Pete Mandick and me, the only qualia quietist I know of. I'm sure there's more, but there's like two of us, so we're not getting any attention. But that can be a little frustrating when you're just shuffled off in a footnote. But a note I'll make about that is if you have like all the like you have reductive physicalism, non-reductive physicalism, and then everything else, whether it's some type of substance dualism or panpsychism or anything else that can purportedly handle psychophysical harmony in a way that non-reductive physicalism can't. If the argument ends up looking to me like, hey, if you're a non-reductive physicalist, you have a lot of problems. And let's say that they successfully show that that's the case. Their proposed alternative is like all the other stuff on the metaphysically heavier side, but they don't seem to consider the stuff on the metaphysically less committed side, like quietistic and illusionist positions. And if the argument is really an argument against non-reductive physicalism, to the extent that you succeed, that elevates the probability of both of those accounts, both the like non-physicalist accounts and physicalist accounts that dispense with qualia. They both benefit from taking down the sort of one in the middle. And I feel like that would have been a cool way to frame their argument. Like I look at their argument and I'm like, hey, if this is successful, it's a great argument for illusionism.
Yes, exactly. Because both work. And you know, as a game designer, it's a lot of my head is in the user experience all the time. I'm always trying to put the blinders on myself, right? And thinking about what is the psychology of the person reading this paper as they go? What parts are they probably skipping? What parts are really gripping them? What parts just hinted at something that they're not going to stop reading because they've got to know the answer that you just seeded, right? And when something is stuck in a footnote, and especially if the thing stuck in a footnote is framed as if it's zany, it's a thing only crazy people say, you know, the normative entanglement kind of issue, then in the reader's mind, they say, I don't need to think about that anymore. That's for crazies. Sounds pretty weird. Stuffed in a footnote and forgotten is the right place for it to remain and to die. And then you get to the end of the paper and you have this attention getting conclusion standing alone in the spotlight with a halo on it. And I remember, you know, just kind of like another example of that normative entanglement, which is where the way you frame someone's position, you're earmarking something really objectionable to it that most people will disagree with, that isn't actually entailed by that position, but it basically sinks the position. Like you're putting a ball and chain on a position. I think it was Cutter in an article following the publication. I don't remember if it was in the form of an interview. I think it was in the form of an interview, but it was something like, well, you know, there is error theory, but on that theory, pain isn't bad. And he proceeded to like talk about this stuff. And to an unwitting reader, it sounds like, oh, these are kooks. Who in their right mind would say pain isn't bad? Okay, yeah, I guess so. Their enemies are idiots. So I think I can ignore those fools. When it's like, well, no, on error theory, pain is still bad. It's just they wouldn't necessarily put it that way, or they would say when we say pain is bad, those words mean something non-literal, or they are buggy ways of saying this other stuff. But they don't say that, like, oh yeah, when I put my hand on a hot stove, it's not bad. You know, they don't do that. And that's what it kind of sounded like. And then again, like they were relegated to a fringe position, and then they don't need to be dealt with, leaving the spotlight, you know, this attention getting conclusion to stand alone.
Yeah, I do worry that I don't know what Cutter and Crowan's views are on that issue, but for at least some philosophers, they will just outright say, yeah, that position is ridiculous or absurd or has outrageous conclusions. I constantly see people say this about a philosophical position they'll say, well, it has terrible implications or it has awful consequences. And then they don't elaborate. So what are the awful consequences? And often the remarks are just left hanging. So it's left to the reader to figure out what they mean. This just came up in, let me see if I could find it right now so I could give people a live example of this happening. This was in one of Mike Humer's latest blog posts. Let me see if I could find it. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so here it is. So here is the quote, and I'll try to put it in the chat. I'll probably split it up, but we'll see. Here's what Humer says. It is the anti-realists who have an extreme view. They claim that no moral intuitions should be trusted and no moral beliefs constitute knowledge. On their view, e.g., we don't know that it's wrong to throw children into a fire for fun. So the anti-realist here is depicted as extreme because they say, we don't know that it's wrong to throw children into a fire for fun.
Uh-huh.
What does that sound like to you?
They're psychos. Yeah.
It sounds like the anti-realist is some sort of maniac. That's like if someone threw a child into a fire in front of them, they'd be, and everyone's like freaking out going, oh my God, they'd be like, well, we don't know that that's bad. Well, how do we know? And the kid's screaming and everyone's freaking out.
Yeah.
We don't know. We don't know.
And quite frankly, Humer knows better. He knows what effect he's having on readers. Like he could carry that through and say, now this might sound like they're psychos, but to fairly represent them, that doesn't really follow. They just have this different framing or portrayal. Sounds a little bit exotic, but it's internally consistent. And these people, your babies are not in danger from these people. But he doesn't. He leaves it there and lets it do its rhetorical work.
Right, because he could include, and this is why I did research on this, where I used pragmatic cancellation. Because if something is pragmatically implied, you can cancel it verbally by saying, but that's not the case. So a person can say, look, I don't think it's objectively wrong to throw children into a fire for fun, but I do think it's awful, horribly wrong, super repugnant. It's just that technically speaking, when you throw objectivity in there, that brings up some metaphysical issues, and I don't endorse that metaphysical framework for looking at the world. But that has nothing to do with my attitude about throwing children into a fire for fun, which is that I think it's equally, if not more horrible, than the moral realist standing next to me. And I'm equally, if not more motivated to do everything in my power to prevent that from happening. That would be an appropriate way of characterizing an anti-realist, to make sure you're not depicting the person you're arguing against as an evil moron. And yet, realists routinely do this with anti-realists. And this isn't just in this area. There's another paper I respond to. It's a argument that David Chalmers discusses, and it has to do with consciousness. And it basically is like, yeah, if you're an illusionist and you don't think anyone feels pain, but people do feel pain, so illusionism is wrong. So you got this kind of, I don't know if I structured that properly, but it's some type of modus tollens, which is supposed to be a reductio of illusionism. People don't feel pain. That's ambiguous. It's ambiguous between a functional interpretation of pain and a phenomenal interpretation of pain. So the other problem with that is that illusionism. So what I end up saying about that is illusionism is a kind of conjunction of views. It's basically people think they have qualia, but they don't have qualia. And the people think they have qualia component of the position is irrelevant to this argument. So the only functionally relevant part of the position is the denial of qualia. And so you could substitute illusionism for we don't have qualia, like the view that we don't have qualia, and the argument works as intended. And then you could specify what's meant by pain, and you have to resolve the ambiguity. What kind of pain are you talking about? Phenomenally conscious pain, like it's a type of phenomenal state or not? If it is a phenomenal state, then you're saying something like the view that there's no phenomenal states holds that there's no phenomenal states, but there are phenomenal states. Therefore, it's not the case that there are no phenomenal states. What? So the position is if not P, then not P, but P, therefore not P, which you could just convert back into P. So you might as well have the argument be if not P, then not P, P, therefore P.
Right. And
that's what the argument amounts to.
And I have to say, I mean, no one wants to hear that a bunch of problems in philosophy are actually problems of rhetoric and marketing, but they are. I mean, at least that's my perspective. Like where um, uh, you know, you could call it qualitylessness, right? You could call the position that instead of calling it illusionism. And then that would rob the rhetorician of indexing on the literal meaning of illusion and drawing too much inference out to portray it in the way that's unintended. And of course, we know that happens with moral anti-realism, where it's like, did you know that on moral anti-realism, morality is real in many ways and in many senses of the term real, because there are many senses of the term real. It's just the sense of stance independent reality that is denied. But that's sure not what the name sounds like. The name sounds like morality is stupid. Morality is fake. Morality is nothing. It's pointless, meaningless. That's what the name sounds like, which is an opportunity. Any sort of rhetorician who is choosing to take that approach to combat that perspective has this tool available to them to trip up the unwitting reader and make a mountain out of a molehill with normative entanglement.
Yeah, in fact, that's actually worth dwelling on for a moment because I focus so much on anti-realism, and I have had even like professional philosophers say, well, of course, anti-realists think that morality isn't real. And I have pointed out, I did read and I did appreciate the book by Spencer Case and Matt Lutz called "Is Morality Real?" But the title itself, I think, frames the realist anti-realist debate in a way that I think is confusing and misleading to
Yeah,
people.
it
And
is.
they wanted to set that up as an accessible book for, it's not mega technical at every portion. It's more accessible. I would consider using it in a class, but part of what I would do is discuss my reservations about the title. I don't know if they decided on the title. Maybe sometimes publishers twist your arm
Yeah,
about the
what's
title.
going to sell, Lance? What's going to get the attention at a glance? Like, oh, geez, could it not be real at all? This book is going to tell you. And it seems like there's a ton at stake. And one of the like missions of anti-realism is to say, okay, look, some stuff is at stake, but the babies aren't at stake. Like
Yeah.
we all care about the same things largely, us normies anyway. Like all of that's in common. The only difference is the framing. And again, it comes back to like, how do you want to define it? How do you want to define these terms? And that's it. And some of those decisions about how to define terms lead you into a heap of trouble. Other times, they're very refreshing. They make sense of things. You say, oh, that's a little weird, but at least we can get something done. We can move on. Uh, and I mean, that's the quietest thing in a nutshell. I mean, really, there's this meta pattern. Like I keep wanting to point out to this because I just want to like put images in people's heads. I want you to feel a certain thing. When you think quietism, think, oh, it's whenever the answers are almost too boring to say. That's almost too stupid. How could that be the answer? These smart people have been talking about it for centuries. It's just about how you define things. Come on. It's all of this stuff that you don't want to hear, right? Loudness is the stuff that keeps the conversation going so that it self broadcasts, gets attention, triggers people so they have to respond, and has nuggets in there that are hard to isolate, like polysemies about words that if you look them up in the dictionary, there's just one meaning there. What are you talking about? Multiple meanings. But oh dear, it turns out a lot of these terms have dozens of meanings depending on their combinations of litmus criteria. And any single difference can be used to make a bad syllogism effectively. And that's what we're up against. So like the quietism versus loudness thing should be making you feel that way, and then you can see it. Like you just start to see it more and more. It's like, oh geez, I see what's going on here. That part's ambiguous. That part's getting hidden. That thing is being misportrayed in what appears to be a motivated way. Why are they saying that? Oh, is morality real or not? That's what moral realism and anti-realism is about. That's, you only say that if you're making claptrap. If you're up on stage debating and you're trying to win over a naive audience, that's dishonest. And like we talked about last time that we were on this, I went through a period where I was willing to do that. in my late teens and early 20s, back in the early 2000s, when I had my crisis. Like I had the thrill, the high school debater thrill of taking on a position and defending it at any cost, including my own integrity. And it was very interesting, the psychological layers that I was able to put in place to fool myself into thinking I was doing nothing wrong. Uh, Overconfidence isn't lying, right? It's just overconfidence. That's just a little bit of a fudge. And because I lived that and then went through an embarrassing period of like self reckoning and purgation, I come back and I'm like, I see these people doing this stuff and I'm going to say it because I'm tired of it. And I've got one life to live. So I, might, when I name drop someone and like humor and I say he knows better, I think so. I think he's being deceptive in a way. I'm going to say it. And just because, I don't know, maybe it's because my frustration with the innate nature of quietism. Okay, well then I guess I'm going to be extra loud in saying the quiet part. You know, I'm gonna, if I notice that someone is putting together an argument, you know, that has issues, but I think are unwitting, which is I think the psychophysical harmony paper is one of those. But decisions can have effects, and they can sure have the same kind of effect as someone doing something deceptively. And then of course there are people who I worry are being deceptive because they're trying to build a brand, grow their follower count or what have you.
Yeah, it's tough for me. I don't like to psychologize people. I don't like to one thing
Right.
I say to people is like, you're not telepathic. You don't actually know. And I do think people in many of these the like online debate spaces are way too quick. People will throw around the term disingenuous and the term bad faith with
Yeah.
just reckless abandon, and that does frustrate me. There's been a few times when I've said, "What do you mean by disingenuous?" And then the person suddenly gets weird and they don't want to tell me. Because in some cases, I think people habituate themselves to just deploying schemas. Like it's almost like they have the cognitive equivalent of a soundboard where you push and it's like Homer Simpson saying like "no." So they just have a soundboard in their head of disingenuous, ad hominem, disingenuous, disingenuous, bad faith, disingenuous. And I'm actually working on a blog post on this. I got caught up because it ended up getting longer and longer as it ballooned out of control. But I'm calling it the pigeon principle. And the idea behind the pigeon principle is I basically want to go back and say, hey, look, I know that the age of behaviorism is over and everybody has abandoned B.F. Skinner and left him by the wayside. But I do think an enormous amount of human behavior is just a kind of very sophisticated operant conditioning where, you had mentioned before, like when the philosopher puts out that paper and they get all the reactions, ooh, I'm going to do more of this. That is exactly how I think it's a very primordial feature of the way humans are motivated to act, because it's the way all organisms are motivated to act. Is that approach avoid reward and punishment it's not the end all be all of all human cognition. And to the extent that any behaviorist was ever committed to such a view, fine, they had too sweeping and universal a view of the scope of human cognition. Fair enough, but you don't step away from that and then forget about it entirely as though it were never a big thing. It is a big thing. People are responsive to awards. People are responsive to punishments. And we see this in certain features of the way humans interact. So I had an unfortunate experience when I was very young. I ate a key lime pie that had gone bad. It made me sick. I probably ate most of it too. So I ate a whole rotten pie. I haven't been able to eat key lime. I grew up in Florida. That's why I had a key lime pie. They're everywhere. I haven't been able to eat it for 30 years. If someone talks about key lime pie, I'm not getting nauseous now, but if I see it or smell it, I'm like, ah.
Yeah.
So that is my brain saying, you got sick, that caused it, don't eat it. And it stuck with me. I haven't conditioned myself. I need to recondition myself because I don't even know what it tastes like, but I'm sure it's good. So our brains do that. They're reward and punishment systems. And I do feel like a lot of what is able to self-perpetuate in philosophy, and I think in academia as a whole, is this reward response type thing where people push the arguments that get reactions and they don't push the arguments that don't. And that's misaligned with good arguments, with virtuous arguments. Instead, people push the arguments that work for their social goals. And this is a big theme in my approach to human psychology more generally, is that I favor, I don't know if you've heard of this, but these authors, Sperber and Mercier, put together this argument for the argumentative theory of reasoning, where they argue that a big factor in the evolution of human reasoning was to facilitate persuasion and argumentation. And so a lot of what you can construe cognitive biases, like motivated reasoning, they're a bias with respect to the goal of acquiring accurate, reliable about what the world is like. They are not biases if one's goal is to win over one's opponents. And so very, very roughly, people argue, reason, and think, generally speaking, in most contexts, a bit like more like a lawyer that has a case to defend.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Rather than someone that's aspiring towards the truth. And when you put that in perspective, and then you look at what philosophers are doing, it sure looks a hell of a lot to me like there's a lot more lawyering going on than philosophizing. And that is
yes. One of the big rules that you learn early, or if you don't learn it early, working on live game services, you eventually realize it, is that people follow incentives. That's what they do. And it takes such a, incentive gradients are a thing everybody struggles with, where they end up just tumbling down a hill toward bad states. And then they have to this like moment where they realize, what have I done? I've been doing this whole time. I have to change or whatever. But meanwhile, on the ramp, everything's so gradual. You just continue. It seems to be working out. I'm getting all of this feedback and things are fine. I think that a lot of published philosophy that gets attention has its own, like, even if the institution had no selection bias, even if the institution was just like, look, everything that passes muster in ways that you and I can all agree are very virtuous. Okay, publish. You have ones that are going to get more attention than others, right? If the thing does not get attention, then it doesn't get attention, right? I don't see many papers that don't get attention because that's almost tautological. Yeah, like it's not attracting attention. So I tend not to see those things, right? I tend to see the things that start attracting attention. Things that attract attention are things with interesting conclusions that seem confident, right? If it's milquetoast, limp, doesn't get attention. Because at the end of the article, they're like, well, could be this other thing we talked about in that footnote, raises the probability of both. So we're just kind of left in a lurch. What a lame ending, right? What an ending that doesn't get attention. You want an ending that gives them something, whoa, goodness, you've left me with something to reckon with. And I'm tracing through your syllogisms. I see the confidence percolate through. And yet your premises are things that none of us would deny. That's attention getting, right? Because that takes us from this place of neutrality to a place of assertiveness, a place that makes a splash, right? And so then you just have to ask yourself, okay, what kinds of tools, rhetorical tools, enable assertive conclusions that are in fact overconfident to be presented in ways that even the writer did not understand what they were up to. Like even the person reasoning their way through, brilliant people or pair of people or group of people, what things can hoodwink even them? That's the mission. Like, obviously some stuff has to be like this. So what should we look for in things that follow that kind of pattern? And we find them. We find those things. And policemies are probably the biggest culprit. You know, words that just feel like they have such a strong, clear meaning, but are being used in subtly different ways in order to hop non sequiturs. Not just that, but also modal polysemy, like modal scope fallacies are a form of that. It's where you're using the word possible here, but guess what? It was in a different modality. You can't use S5 to squish possibility and necessity together if they breach those modal barriers. It's not allowed. You're just going to create errors. And the biggest lesson is that in computer code, errors crash the system. They don't do that in philosophy. They allow for the execution of arbitrary code. Errors present as eurekas in philosophy when behind either a person maliciously motivated, which I don't think is most people, but motivated by the natural incentives of the institution.
That last part, I'm going to work backwards. I took notes because there was a few things I wanted to address. If I'm freezing up, it's still that same issue. I haven't got resolved. I can't find this remark, but I recall hearing that Dan Dennett said something like, so this is like a very hearsay-y remark, that one of the things about programming that makes it so awesome is that it keeps you honest. There can't be a lie in your code because it won't run. And I thought that was a cool way of looking at the structure of programming, that it has a kind of precision that everyday language doesn't. And it has that advantage in that respect, but it lacks the flexibility of everyday language. So there's trade-offs. I thought that was just an interesting connection to that. Then again, backwards order, modal scope. One of the interesting things that came up in my empirical research on how people were interpreting questions about metaethics was this possibility of a modal scope problem. And it was a colleague of mine, Tyler Milhouse, who pointed out. We presented on it at a conference years ago now, like 8 years ago. And here's the problem. I don't know if you've seen this in any of my previous videos where I discuss this really funny finding. So you have all these studies in metaethics that rely on this paradigm called the disagreement paradigm. And you simply tell the person about a disagreement. It could be between themselves and another person or two other people. Let's go with two other people because it's easier. So Alex and Sam disagree about whether abortion is right or wrong. Sam thinks abortion is right. Sam thinks it's not right. Do you think they could both be correct, or must at least one of them be incorrect? And then you get people's responses to that. Here's the interesting thing. So James Beebe came along and gave people questions, and this was common to give people questions in other domains besides morality to compare and contrast how people responded in those other domains. They can partially work as a control condition. If you get people giving both people could be correct for moral issues, that might be insightful, but only if you get expected patterns in other domains. So for aesthetics and taste preferences,
right,
you might expect to say both people could be correct. And for factual issues like Mount Everest is the tallest mountain, you should expect people to say at least one person has to be incorrect. There's only one right answer. Here's the funny thing. What BB did is give people historical and other factual issues that are controversial or uncertain. And so one of these is two people. So Alex and Sam disagree about whether Julius Caesar drank wine on his 21st birthday. Now, nobody's in a position to know that. And so if they disagree, that presents you with a challenging situation. You don't know which of the two people is correct. It could be either one of them. So then we look at that question. Can Alex and Sam both be correct, or must at least one of them be incorrect? And I don't know if do you happen to know the results they got for this?
I don't know the results. I'm curious.
Okay, so if they interpreted this as a question as two people disagree about whether an historical event occurred, can they both be right? The answer ought to be, unless we think people are historical relativists, no, they can't both be right. At least one of them has to be mistaken.
Yeah.
Because obviously a historical event can't both have occurred and not occurred. And whether it occurred or not depends on whether you prefer if it occurred. I prefer that he drank. I would think it'd be cool if he drank wine. And therefore he literally did so. And then someone else is like, well, I don't like wine. I would have preferred if he drank beer. So he literally drank beer instead. So he didn't drink wine. That's insane. People don't think that.
Yeah.
So, but 45% of people said they could both be correct. So if two people disagree about whether Caesar drank wine, they could both be correct. He both did and didn't drink wine at the same time. What? So what Tyler proposed is there could be modal operator scope ambiguity. So here's a couple questions I'd like to give people to illustrate this. So the Yankees and the Red Sox are playing in the World Series. Can they both win the World Series this year? No,
Right.
right?
Right. Depending on the modality.
Right. Well, it's usually the pragmatic context resolves the ambiguity, so that we people understand only one team can win the World Series. If they know about the World Series, they'll say only no, they can't both win. But if I said, hey, let's go to the restaurant. I'm going to get an omelet. Do you want to get an omelet too? And someone says, well, can you both get an omelet? Typically, people would say yes, because there's no reason pragmatically to think restaurants only have one of each item at a given time. So usually the context or background knowledge you have about the particular thing in question will resolve an ambiguity about can these both be true at the same time. And there's two different interpretations of can they both happen. There's an inclusive and an exclusive one. The inclusive one is can it be this one, that one, or both? Can it be A, B, or both A and B? The exclusive one is can it be A or B? And if you rule out, but it can't be A or B. And so can it be both is ambiguous between the two. And that is not resolved in the questions that philosophers or experimental philosophers, some of them might be psychologists. Anyway, whatever. That ambiguity is not resolved in the questions that researchers are giving to participants because there's no background context. And so this is a serious problem with psychological research, is that you're pulling questions out of the context in which they would ordinarily be asked, decontextualized questions. That's the other thing. Researchers also presume that if you frame, if the question is worded in exactly the same way, you can simply swap out one item for another, and the question will be interpreted the same way. So if two people disagree about whether an historical event happened, that's very uncertain. Could they both be correct, or must at least one of them be incorrect? Well, what are people thinking there? I suspect what people are thinking is one or the other could be correct, but not both. In other words, they're thinking of it in exclusive terms. But then if you're talking about food preferences, one person likes cheeseburgers, one person hates them, can they both be correct? Then you're thinking of it in inclusive terms. So the wording can be identical, but the interpretation is different because the context varies. And the researchers are using items that are insensitive to the meaning of the question changing in accordance with the substantive content of what people are disagreeing about, rather than the grammatical structure of the question. So right there, you have the modal operator scope ambiguity emerging in the context of research, and researchers literally don't appear to notice or appreciate that this is a phenomenon that can occur. It's really wild.
Yeah. The and what's funny is, like, they might say, well, you know what, we'll word this so carefully that the context is just ultra clear. Well, sometimes even when you're so careful, people tend to interpret it in two different ways. Like, just depends on the person. And guess what? The results of that research tell you that's the results. It's like, oh, well, this group of people interpreted it this way, and this other group interpreted it the other way. And okay, that's interesting. That's useful. It tells you there's a problem. It tells you when you got to be careful, when you got to explicate, and that's fine. But it tells you nothing about, like, something beyond the language issues, the lexical issues of what they really meant by possible. So you said could they win the World Series? I have a video on can or could, and the police me, four-way police me on can or could. But the reason why I got to that point is because could and can are used as stand-ins for possible. And that's because if you trace possible backwards in etymology, it's like about potency. It's about what can we do? And that's the framing that you kind of have in your head. Whereas in modality, I find it's much safer to think of possibility as whatever isn't ruled out by some set of schema and data. In other words, it's what's allowed by this governor, and so it's not about, like, potence. It's just about unrestrictedness per some litmus for the modal context that you're in. And when we do that, it makes a lot of stuff just makes a lot more sense. So I talk about examples like, we say it's possible that Cleopatra wasn't killed by an asp, right? I mean, we hear the records, but it's possible she wasn't. And most people say, yeah. And then you say, but she had to die some way, right? What if she really did? Then could she not? Oh, no, never mind. Or like one experiment that I've done is, like, you take a cup and you put a coin in the cup, you shake it around, you slam it on the table without looking. and then you say, okay, it landed, we heard it. Is it possibly heads and possibly tails? And this messes with people because they know the coin landed. It's the way it is. God or whoever knows what the coin is, but we're still talking about possibilities. What the heck is going on? It's like, oh, it's because it's in a different modality. And it turns out that what is the situation with the coin right now is the same situation of epistemic possibility as if I haven't even flipped the coin yet. You got a Schrodinger's coin. And then, once you start to unpack that, you realize that, could do otherwise. When the otherwise is defined vacuously as against whatever you do, it's like, if you paid me $100 to do otherwise, I have no idea how I'd cash that in. Like, how do I do that? I've never done otherwise in my life. I've done otherwise than certain things. Like, if you fill in the blank, I can tell you when I've done otherwise than my homework. I slacked off instead, right? But I've never just done otherwise, because that's an abstraction defined against whatever you did. I can't do that. I can do one of two things in prospect if my epistemic condition doesn't rule either of them out. But I definitely know, if they are mutually exclusive, that only one of them is alethically possible once we get there. And this sounds so nerdy and pedantic, right? But unless you spell it out, you get can do otherwise free will papers by the hundreds, yammering about this stuff and seemingly oblivious to it.
Yeah, you do. I was going to bring up could have done otherwise. So a funny thing is that one of the stimuli I tried to use to figure out what's going on with the modal operator scope ambiguity is coin flips, because I figured that would be a really clear and straightforward way of showing people, like showing, okay, if this is it can in one modality and can't in another modality pretty straightforwardly. So one thing I did want to address, though, is the issue of what's going on with philosophers not noticing this. And I think this might be the last thing we address, because I'm going to have to go soon, which is that, you may regard and judge some of them as like not being honest. And you might be right in some cases. I don't know. I don't know how confident you are in particular cases. I'm not confident in many cases. And that's not simply because I want to be polite and be on everybody's good side. If I really thought, and I don't care if they have 17 PhDs and they're the president of the Philosophical Society, and they're going to tell me I'm not invited to their parties anymore if I say so. If I really thought, if I was really confident that they were being a disingenuous jerk, I might say so. And if I think they're being a jerk, I might say that. But one of the things I recognize about many philosophers that don't hold views like mine is that I hold a minority position on the nature of language, on metaphilosophy, on how philosophy is to be done. And they hold very different views about how language works. So I think the whole idea of trying to sort out the correct semantic thesis in one's metaethical theory is absurd. Like philosophers will say things like moral claims express propositions. And when I've asked them what they mean by that, I've often asked, are you making an empirical claim about the communicative intent of speakers? Or are you making some other kind of claim? It's like evenly divided. Some of them will say, yeah, it's an empirical claim about like the psychology of the speaker. Some of them will say, no, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the meaning of the claim. The claim has a meaning independent of the speaker. And so it may be that humor and non-naturalist moral realists in general, they believe in a much more robust conception of a priori knowledge than I do. They employ a method of armchair a prioristic theorizing, where they don't think, or at least don't in practice go out and do empirical research on how people use moral sentences. They think about the sentences outside of any context of usage, and they try to figure out what the sentences mean outside of context of usage. Now, I think that literally makes no sense. I don't think sentences mean anything outside of context of usage. Any more than if I described an action, walking down the street. Why was the person walking down the street? That doesn't make sense. It's not connected to anything. Who, where, when, why? You can't analyze the intentions of a fictional underdescribed being. You can't analyze the meaning of a sentence no one's saying it. So that's my view of language, but I'm pretty sure that's not humor's view of language. And so if humor is looking at moral sentences in this way and his employing methods, I think, are misguided, and reaching conclusions, I think, are conceptually confused. Humer may be very confident in that method and maybe looking at the results of that method and thinking, okay, well, I have an expert faculty for intuiting the correct analysis of the meaning of these sentences. Lance is failing to use that faculty or doesn't have the faculty or something. And so my analysis of these sentences is correct. If you think like an error theorist, you don't see it, you don't think there's anything wrong with throwing children into a fire for fun. So I think that might be a completely sincere expression of his position on the matter. And I think this might generally be true of philosophers. And my issue is not disingenuity, but a commitment to fundamentally misguided metaphilosophical presuppositions. So I don't know what you make of that.
I think that like there's undertones of you admonishing me in a good way because I don't want to be inconsistent, right? And one of my biggest pet peeves is when people use needless bivalence to be louder than they should be. So, for example, is the person being honest or dishonest, right? And I said, yeah, I think they might be a little bit dishonest or something. Could there be layers of things happening there? Could they just be being sloppy? I've done that before. Sometimes I'm almost deliberately sloppy because I just want to let something ride and I don't have time to clean it up, right? And I know that some of his posts on Facebook they read like that, right? He's letting something go and then, harvesting the responses and getting whatever he can from them. And so does that fit neatly into this telic box of malice or something? Absolutely not. Which means that I got to be careful with what I say when I say stuff like that. I mean, on the inside, the way I feel is that he should know better when he pulled that maneuver. I think that maybe if he sat with it for a few minutes, he would say, yeah, that was kind of iffy. I do that stuff too. Like you could, if you look through my Twitter or something, you'll find things where it's like, hey, aren't you doing this trick that you call out in these other places? I'm like, all right. Yeah, I think I probably was doing that or whatever. And what that reminds us is that we all should be a bit gracious to one another. We should avoid psychologizing. And at the same time, I don't want to be a permanent phenomenal conservative with regard to what's going through people's heads. And sometimes like the BS adds up, but it's a balance. I mean, it's an epistemic dance. It's a moral dance, and there may not be like a one method of how to behave in this regard.
Yeah, I do think I waver too much on the side of caution, and there might be some bias towards not wanting to burn bridges or alienate myself from people.
Right.
And maybe that's reasonable. Like, look, if I go around saying everybody that disagrees with me is a liar, they're not going to want to talk to me. And that's probably motivating me to not go around saying that, even if there's some cases where I think it might be true. And so I grant that I might be doing that. And that worries me because that means I might not be as sincere as I'd like to be. And I also might have very little control over it because some of that might be unconsciously motivating me. I'm not sure.
And there are trade-offs. I'm an outsider, so I can say that stuff without burning any bridges. At the same time, it means it's more likely that I'm going to say something recklessly when I really should be holding my tongue about stuff.
Yeah, but I could be too incautious.
Yeah.
Philosophers can fail when they just absolutely pull their punches constantly in every encounter. And I used to be much more of a I used to go around saying like Christianity is evil and stupid and every Christian should know better and blah blah blah, and I would just go run my mouth about how terrible and awful all religions are. I would say all religions are evil. It doesn't matter, and Buddhism is evil. Like I'm embarrassed that I said stuff like that now. I mean, it would be too long of a discussion now to get into why, but
right, as we're out of time.
But that was too much. So part of what I did to compensate for that is to lean in the other direction of being super. Do my best to be super chill. But I should say my natural default settings, like the factory settings, are angry and yelling and being mean to everybody. And so it's taken a lot of work to go in the other direction. And now, because I've entered these online spaces and I argue with people, I sometimes run into people that are jerks. and I want to say you're being a disingenuous jerk, and I don't know what to do because I have conditioned myself to not say that, and so I'm too much in the other direction. So everybody's going to be miscalibrated.
Yeah,
No one's going
there's
to
a
be perfectly
Hamilton and Burr inside each one of us that we have to on our shoulders.
All right, I do have to get going. I have something I got to do in literally like 1 minute, so we got to wrap
Right.
up there.
Yeah.
But we do have 1 minute. So any final thoughts for what you have to say? I mean, I will put a link. In fact, it's already there. A link to your, I think, Twitter, your website, so people will be able to find that stuff and hear more about your stuff. But anything else you wanted to say?
I'll just say one of the most exciting things that you've been doing lately is asking for and pulling for hard examples of normative entanglement. And I would love to encourage everyone who finds those examples or examples of polysemy to get loud about it and tell us about it, because the more we can talk about it and help boost it, and it's a fun hunt, you know, and it's something that all of us who appreciate quietism can do together.
Awesome. Okay. So I will leave it there. Thank you. Thanks, Stan, for being here. Thanks, everybody in the comments. I know we didn't get too much in the way of the comments, but we will another time. I'm pretty active on here now. So I'll leave it there. Please like the video, subscribe, go check out Stan's stuff, do all the things, and I got to get out of here. So I'll see y'all later.